Welcome everybody to the video covering Chapter 8, Supporting Your Ideas. So now you've done your research, you've found some information that you maybe want to use for your speech. What else do you need to know? First off, there are several different types of supporting materials. You have examples, statistics, and testimony, which we're going to go into more detail on. Examples are any time where you use a specific case to illustrate an idea that you're presenting in your speech. So something that maybe needs a little bit more detail, and it would be benefited by having an example included. There's three different types of examples. There is the brief example, the extended example, and the hypothetical. A brief example is when you have a specific case that you refer to in passing to illustrate a point. So it's not something that is a lengthy analogy, it's just a simple, quick mention within that speech, and then you move on. I will say before I forget as well, in Moodle, the PowerPoint presentation for this particular chapter has multiple video examples, and I strongly encourage you guys to go and review those because it definitely does have some videos that give you better, I would say, a better overview of what these types of examples look like in a speech, and there are video demonstrations of each of those types. So the extended example is a story, a narrative, or an anecdote that you develop at length to illustrate a point. So it might be something that you weave in at the beginning of the speech and you sort of bring back in and out throughout the speech, something that has more of a narrative approach to it rather than one of those brief examples that are just very short. A hypothetical example is another option. This is one where you're describing a fictitious situation. One of those, imagine if you were sitting on a beach or what have you, something that, you sort of paint a picture, you give this fictitious example in order for your audience to better understand what you're trying to illustrate. Some tips for examples. When you're doing examples or using examples, you can use them to help clarify the ideas that are within your speech. So maybe something isn't quite obvious, you could use an example. You could also use examples to reinforce ideas that are in your speech, just give it a little bit more punch. You can also use them in order to personalize your ideas, especially if it's maybe a topic that's a little bit dry, a little bit clunky. Adding in some type of example will help it seem a little bit more personal to you, something that makes it seem a little more interesting in general to the audience. That's not to say that the example needs to be an example from your own personal life. It could just be something that helps give it that personal touch. As you're giving examples, make sure that you're using vivid language, richly textured language. Don't just throw an example in there for the sake of it. Make sure that it's something that's developed and that will actually mean something to the audience. And then also make sure to practice beforehand in terms of your delivery so that you can enhance that example, because examples are a really good opportunity to really use your nonverbals, and that gives it that extra flair and really makes a statement. When we're talking about statistical measures that you can incorporate in your speech, three in particular you want to be aware of are the mean, median, and mode. So averages, thinking back to like grade school math. You probably already know, maybe just a refresher, the mean is an average value of a group of numbers. So adding them up, dividing by the number, and then that gives you the mean average of a group of numbers. That is typically the one that you want to use more often than not. That would be considered the most reliable statistic that you can use. And I will say right now that sometimes when you find statistics and someone is trying to maybe manipulate data, they might use the mode or the median instead. So you have to be aware of opportunities for people to kind of manipulate the overall actuality of the statistics. So identify when it is a time where the mean isn't being used, because you don't want to misrepresent data. The median is the middle figure within a group. So you order all the numbers from highest to lowest, and you pick the one that's right in the middle. So you can see where that might be a little bit, misconstruing the data, because it won't necessarily be exactly the average. Same goes for the mode. This is where there's a number that occurs most often or most frequently within that group, and that would be the number that's used. And again, it could slightly skew the reality of the average of that group. As you're using statistics, there are a few tips you want to be aware of. You can use them to help you quantify ideas. People do like data. Some people like data. It kind of, makes it seem official. And so you can use that to help quantify some of these like broader concepts that you might be presenting. However, you want to use them sparingly, because they can become very boring. It can turn a speech into a very dry, unappealing speech. So use them only when it really enhances your speech. When you're using them, you still need to identify the sources that you're pulling that information from. Make sure you explain the statistics thoroughly so that we understand, how it fits into the broader scheme of your speech, as well as, sometimes statistics can be pretty intricate. So you need to make sure and walk the audience through a statistic with enough detail that we can understand what that number or those data are actually saying. If you have large numbers, especially, you want to round them off. So rather than saying 75,212, just say approximately 75,000 or approximately 75,200, somewhere in there, just so that you don't have an overabundance of words that you're using to describe that number. And then use visual aids if needed. If it's something that it seems like a visual aid would be a good approach to actually graphically represent the statistic, go for it. Use a graph, use a chart, whatever it happens to be, to help lay it out so that we can visually see what's really going on there, especially if it's a large quantity of data that you're presenting. It might need to be in a visual aid so that people can really absorb what you're describing. Another type of way of supporting an idea is by using a testimony. These are quotations or paraphrases that you use to support a point. There are a few different types. There's expert testimony. So this is where it's a testimonial that's made by a recognized expert, some type of statement that an expert on record offers. You could also utilize a peer testimony, which is testimony from just an ordinary person that has firsthand experience or insight into that particular topic. You want to be careful with this because it definitely doesn't hold as much clout or doesn't offer as much credibility as an expert testimony. But sometimes, it can mean a lot. It could potentially contribute to your speech. So just keep in mind that you want to make sure the person that you are getting that testimonial from is credible. They do know what they're talking about. You might have kind of sensationalized their amount of expertise, and then you get to talking to them and realize, oh, well, yeah, maybe they don't know so much about this as I thought. So just, keep your eyes open and make sure that you're not using any data or statistics or testimonial that wouldn't necessarily be accurate. A direct quote is when there is a testimony that you present word for word. So they say it or they write it and you copy it word for word, and you make sure that you represent that within your outline and within your speech. When you're using quotes, you want to make sure that you don't take them out of context. So do not by any means distort a statement that's made by taking out words selectively, or phrases that they surrounded that quote by that gave it a little bit more information and detail, to the point where you plucked it out of what they did say and made it mean something entirely different or even slightly different. You should make sure that when you provide a quote, it is representing the ideas and the thoughts of that person that made that testimony. A paraphrase is when you use a source's ideas in your own words. You restate those ideas, but you, again, cannot manipulate or change those ideas at all. You still have to properly represent what they were saying. So just a few other tips, and some of this is going to be sort of just review. You want to make sure you quote and you paraphrase accurately, that you are still saying what that initial source did. Use qualified sources. Make sure that your sources are unbiased, so they shouldn't believe very strongly one way or another, to the point where they ignore the other side of the argument. And then you want to make sure to identify any sources that you use in your speech. When you're doing that, identifying your sources, you'll want to make sure in your speech to come out and mention the name of the document or the place where you got the information, the author or sponsoring organization, any qualifications that you're aware of, because that adds credibility, and then a date. So here is a general example of how you might do that in a speech. So the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, so right there, they're saying where they found it, of January 31st, 2018, there's your date, quotes Chris Nowinski, the author, co-founder of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, right there, that's his credentials, on the dangers of youth tackle football. And here we see this is a direct quote because we're using the quotation marks. Children, he says, were never intended to be hit in the head 500 times in 3 months every year while their brain is going through incredible development. So we see that this particular example, they are providing all of that information in order to provide credibility for your citation. If you can put that information into your speech, that says to the audience, okay, they did their research. The person they're citing obviously knows what they're doing. I should be, pretty comfortable appreciating that this is true, that this isn't trying to, falsely imply something that doesn't actually exist or isn't actually real. So that is it for this particular video. And as I said, please check out those videos in the PowerPoint on your own so you get a better idea of some of the ideas that we brought up in this video today. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.